In order to investigate the historical significance of specific countercultures in the 60s, something to do with revolutionary action, I thought it was meaningful to go directly to a primary source or two and speak with some people who were active in the 60s. And they might not call themselves activists, but they were certainly involved in movements. And I thought that it would be meaningful to hear directly from them in terms of the character of their countercultural movements, the practices of their specific groups, how the context of the times informed their revolutionary message, and certainly whether or not they felt their groups had a local, national, or global impact. So I spoke with Jack Levert and Cindy Ballinger. We did two interviews with two activists, and the talk was really about one revolution. Jack spoke a lot about the SDS and the Watchmen and the newspaper collective that he was a part of called the Spark. And Cindy spoke primarily about her work with the USSF coffee houses that she coordinated and her efforts to change the minds and spirits of people in the military to get them to stop the war from within. So both efforts spoke towards an anti-war movement. That was probably the overarching theme um, of the counterculture that they belonged to, but certainly they were involved in from different angles. And I thought it would be valuable to hear directly from some people who lived it and experienced it, and to learn more from them, learn as much as possible through a conversation. And that's the conversation that follows.
Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it. Here with Jack Levert, my primary source for this project. And just to give a little background so you know what we're doing here, basically, I want to talk to you about groups that you might be associated with or have been associated with from the 60s, kind of their how they existed as a representation of counterculture, their significance, and their practices. And so, would you mind giving a little background on kind of who you are briefly, and if you've thought about a group or any groups that you had experience with in the 60s?
Okay. Um, I was born in 1946, so in the 60s, I went to school from college from 64 to 68. Those were big years in the movement, and by movement, I would say that that's the way many people thought of whatever we did during those years. As part, whatever we did was a part of a much larger movement that included many different groups, many different ideas, all through the whole world. So I was active from the time I was a teenager um, for many years. That's not all I did, of course, but I was active and I was in many different groups, starting with the civil rights, and then the anti-war movement, and then basic what we might have called anti-capitalist. We called it revolutionary movement, whether it was or wasn't. So there's lots of groups I was part of, but I would say that I and we thought of it as we said then, one struggle.
Were there any groups that people might know or by name, or was it more of a overall feel of kind of a variety of different efforts that you were making, or was there a singular focus? Even if it was a part of a bigger movement, was there a focus of the practices of of a group that you?
Certainly, I was a member, as many people were, of NAACP, CORE, the civil rights groups, and then eventually STS. Certainly, as a student, I was a member of STS, and then I was part of the Columbia, what we call the Columbia Rebellion in '68. I would mention one thing about the Columbia Rebellion is that 1968 was a year of, if not revolution, then tremendous struggle. At Columbia, we took over the whole campus. Eventually, 700 of us were arrested for having done that. At the same time, there was a rebellion and revolution in Paris, Mexico City, throughout Japan, Tokyo. Some of the students, so we all thought of ourselves as part of a large young people student countercultural, anti-war, anti-capitalist rebellion. If not, we wouldn't have said revolution. Some of us would have, some of us wouldn't have. But what we called ourselves, all of us, were rebels. We were in rebellion. And so if you talk about 1968, for example, all the struggles that I just mentioned, in Mexico, hundreds of students were mowed down, killed. In Paris, they almost overthrew, workers joined in and they almost overthrew the government. At Columbia, we had fun. We did not have a big impact. We had a huge impact on the rest of the student movement, which was what we also called it. So, to reiterate, we thought of ourselves with no matter what part of it. We had hippies, we had yippies, we had SDSers, we had Marxists, we had all kinds of different groups. But most of us were generous enough to consider us, the other people, part of the same global movement. So out of those groups, eventually came a group that I'll talk about a little bit more, because I became part of that for after I left school. Eventually ended up leaving the city, as did many people. Back to the country, some people call it. Back to the land. I ended up in Western Massachusetts for a while as a student, and then I quit and became part of a newspaper collective. And that's the group that I guess I would talk about in the early 70s. What do you want to know about that?
Well, I thought it was interesting because you mentioned that all of those different groups that you mentioned from the 60s, be it the group in Columbia or STS, that they were all working. Do you think they were working at different levels, focusing on local, national, global efforts? Or what was the scope of the work that was happening in the 60s with all those groups?
At the same time as it was to be a worldwide revolution, those of us who thought of ourselves as revolutionaries, there were arguments and splits and everything else among groups, some of whom said you start locally, where you are, and others who thought you built coalitions across the spectrum of society as fast as you could. So there were many splits and many arguments. SDS, of course, was split and then destroyed by a fight in 69 or 70, I believe, between a group called Weathermen. That group had decided that one fought globally and violently as a small consciously revolutionary group, including doing violence, which they did, as a supposedly building themselves into a revolutionary army to eventually have revolution in the United States. And they thought they were allied with Cuba. Some of them thought they were allied with China, but they, even though there were only a few of them, thought of themselves as what they called a revolutionary vanguard. They were not doing very much local organizing. Someone else, for example, they in fact ended STS. Someone like myself went back to his community, or what was close enough to my community, and thought that we should organize And we called us, nobody ever said the word activist. We didn't call ourselves activist. That would have been an odd, strange, funny word for us to use. But we called ourselves organizers, and we thought our task was to organize unorganized people, somewhat through persuasion rather than violence, to become opposed to what we called the system, to the war at that point, and so that our activities, anti-capitalist activities, anti-war activities, seem to be part of the same thing. Did we focus on one or another? Some did. When you talk to Cindy, you'll find that what she was doing at the same time was focusing on a different part of the movement she was part of, focusing on direct anti-war activities. And she was also an organizer. She was organizing people in the service at that time. A very dangerous thing to do in some ways. Not physically dangerous, but tricky.
Sure.
So I was in a semi-rural community, the whole western Massachusetts, near Amherst. I'd been in school at UMass for a while. So Amherst, Northampton, Greenfield, up into southern Vermont, as Pioneer Valley is what the region was called. And so it was a changing, a place that was changing in that time, but it was both rural and small town, manufacturing, working class, and our idea was to to put out a newspaper, first of all, that would be picked up by working class people and would give them some alternative ways to think about what was going on. As I said before, we were not separate. We didn't think of ourselves in any way as separate, for example, from the anti-war movement. The civil rights movement was a bit dormant then, so the civil rights was not going on in the same way. The women's movement was just beginning, and certainly Cindy was part of the women's movement, and we were all affected by the women's movement. That is, having to deal with it consciously and continuously in how we dealt with each other, which is one of your questions, which I'll try and answer later in a minute. So what we did was set up a collective, and we put out a newspaper, not a daily newspaper, good grief. Occasionally it was weekly bulletins, but mostly it was a monthly, more magazine in a newspaper form that took into account what we thought were the issues going on locally, and we tried to tie them into the issues going on nationally. And we also did what was called countercultural work, which was we tried to criticize the dominant culture.
Do you think that there's links between the work that you did as a part of all of these groups, seeing it as one collective movement, and anything that's happening today? Be
No.
that no. No.
No, I see very little that has, first of all, I see very little that has any historical knowledge to it. If I mentioned all these things, they would be the various parts of the movement as we understood it. Very few would be even recognized by people today. And without, this is what we thought, without that historical knowledge, we certainly knew about the Wobblies, the IWW, we knew about the communist organizations, we knew all about the various left-wing organizations in history. We studied this stuff. We studied Marx, we studied Engels, we studied Marx, Engels, Lenin, of course, but we also studied the anarcho-syndicalists, which happened to be something that I called myself. We studied the anarchist movements. We studied Spain in 1936, Barcelona in 1937. we, our discussion groups um, were often a lot about history, what had happened, what had gone wrong, or organizational things, not just history as what happened, um, but how the groups had organized themselves and what that meant. So one of your questions was how we organized ourselves, right?
Yeah.
This is crucial, I think, to understanding the movements of the 60s. There were hierarchical and secretive organizations. Progressive labor was one. The labor committees was another. Um, what I just mentioned. Weatherman, secretive, and they were hierarchical. But SDS started off. For example, I was in SDS and I never got a badge or a card or anything else. Most people who were in SDS never joined SDS. It was a fluid, fluctuating, amorphous, democratic, in the real sense of the word democratic, um, consensus uh, group. Um,
And what is that?
Students for Democratic Society. It started in '61. I can't remember when the older people than I had a convention of students and put out a platform and soon just as to become a group of students. And it just spread, not like a virus exactly, but it did spread, and the biggest campuses were Columbia, Chicago, Michigan, the places where if people know the history of the 60s, they know that that's where the most active campuses were and the most trouble occurred. We were the only ones who completely took over our university, but others came close. San Francisco State and Berkeley, of course, are well known for the trouble they gave the authorities. But the method of organization, how decisions were reached, seemed to us back at that time to be the most revolutionary part of what we did. To go back to the newspaper collective, which was called the Spark, by the way, which was probably one of maybe 100 newspapers called the Spark. That was originally the Bolshevik newspaper in 1917, or actually 1905. But many people called many newspaper collectives. We take that word. We called ourselves a newspaper collective, not a newspaper. We didn't call ourselves a commune, although many of us lived on one commune or another collective. There were little distinctions that people made. People who said they lived on a commune often were more opting out of what we thought of as the political struggle. We called ourselves a collective. That's how we organized ourselves, and we made that, called ourselves that, gave ourselves that name, as opposed to a commune, as part of a statement of where we stood in this whole struggle. So we had a newspaper collective, which meant that everything had to be done. Decisions had to be done collectively. I can remember very well, since I was one of the more intellectual of the group, that we attracted. We had street hippies, lots and lots of street hippies. They didn't all live in the street, but they had been hawking, for a quarter each, other alternative newspapers. The alternative newspaper movement was large. I can't think of right now which newspapers have survived and changed, but people would sell them, and they would be more hippies than radicals. That was another distinction, radicals versus hippies. We were radicals, they were hippies. But when they came and asked to be part of our newspaper collective, sort of undemocratically, we demanded that they take charge along with the rest of us. And a number of them did not want to do that. They wanted to either sell the newspaper, help with typesetting, do the minor tasks because they didn't have the confidence or the education or whatever they thought to write or to make editorial decisions or to discuss the politics. And this is perhaps half of our staff, they were content or not daring to go beyond what they thought they could do. And we kind of forced them to do more. And those of us who were better writers or had a clearer concept of this, we didn't do the assigning, but altogether we together assigned various articles and various tasks. There wasn't, I was like one of the head editors at first, but I refused it, as we all, as was part of being an anarcho-syndicalist. We refused it. I had to go out there and hawk the newspaper. I had to do all of the physical tasks.
So that's
had
interesting, because that would lead me to that next question here, which is
had to help write the newspaper. So this was a theory of organization that we meant to be a theory of societal organization if we ever won.
Is there historic significance to the work that was done at this time? I mean, because I can look at media today, I can draw links and say that maybe these are potential seeds for future action. If anyone were students of what has happened in the past, perhaps there's a roadmap for something that needs to happen now, considering media control and how messaging is presented to the masses.
I was reading in a book about the various reform movements earlier of the late 19th century, and it divided the three most important Western rebellious movements, let us call them, into the Marxist-Leninist movement, which of course led to violent revolutions in Soviet Union, China, and so forth, to transform society. There was a gradualist socialist movement of the late 19th century, which, as the book says, led to liberal democratic movements, socialist movements, liberal democracies, left-wing Democrats, and so forth, leading to us, to the Scandinavian countries and so forth, and that was without violence. And then the third movement was the anarcho-syndicalist movement, which attempted to keep groups small, to fight absolutely democratically without any hierarchies, and which, as the book said, led to nothing. I put myself in the third category in a way, and I put the hippies and those of us, that other groups of people who tried to stay with a completely democratic movement. I say that there should be historical relevance, but there isn't if nobody knows about it. Our own newspaper collective, that couldn't exist anymore. It's just not the way information gets transferred. It's not the way people organize themselves. Can they organize themselves into these small collectives as we did? By the way, this is also the beginnings of the women's movement, or what's called the second wave of the women's movement, from 67, 68, 69. And all of us were part of that, whether we wanted to be or not, because the women in our newspaper collective, in SDS, in Weatherman, in wherever it was going on, the women were also becoming more conscious. what the phrase was back then was they were raising their own consciousness. And as they raised theirs, they raised ours, whether we were ready for it or not. And there were lots and lots of people not quite ready. It was done in a much better way, I think, and people could learn, yeah, here's the historical relevance. People could learn now this wokeness that seems to be going on. We didn't have wokeness. We didn't have someone who said something wrong by mistake or who didn't get the whole point at first. That person wasn't shunned, as it seems to be happening now. We painfully had to work many of our disagreements out, and we tried, not without bad things happening, but in general, I would say there was attempts to work this stuff out, much more than there are now.
Given what you see today, today's society, and there's angst, and there is a sense of revolutionary activity about. There's a lot of stuff happening across different states and in different cities, and a lot of kind of like you talked about. There's some shared vision about changes that need to be that need to happen in our society. Do you think that the work you did planted some type of seed that has germinated, even though it's not a linear thing, but
Yes.
do you feel like there are links between the work done and what we're seeing today in kind of calls for societal and global change?
No.
All right, thanks, Jack.
There's too many things have changed. For one thing, without historical knowledge, without knowledge of history, it would be just pure chance. And the bits of historical knowledge that people seem to have are so often cartoon versions, or lies, or silly aspects of it, that I'm not sure what they can gain from it, and people don't seem to have any interest in going back to history. We're the boomers at this point, to be laughed at. There's another difference that I think is more important, which is that our movement in the United States certainly came out of optimism, believe it or not. Optimism. The civil rights movement came out of optimism. We were angry at the fact that our country was not fulfilling its promises. But our country had a promise of democracy, a promise of equality, a promise of it was founded itself as an anti-imperialist country because it was against the imperialism of Great Britain. And anger at how it wasn't adding up to its principles and its promises. And we demanded that it be as good as we had learned, as we had been taught that it was. I see today, I don't see that. I don't see any optimism in the movement, which is why I think that it can become fragmented in other ways, that many of the people who could go one way or another in terms of reform or revolution or anything, go to the right violently, to the left semi-violently. So without a kind of optimism, without a kind of faith, even a faith in, if not, they're not lies, but in a faith in the legends, the myth of our country. With the kind of cynicism that I see now, I'm not sure how much we have in common, that this movement is not as much in common. Could they learn from us? Yeah, I think so. I think they could learn a lot from us. But so often, old comrades and I, when we see something that's going on, say, that's not what we meant. When people do talk about the connections between the struggles of that many years ago and now, I say, no, that's not what we meant. So I don't know. There's only, my last statement would be, remember, this was a long time ago. The 60s were 60 years ago. More time has passed between then and now than had passed between the end of World War One and our time in the sun.
So this project we're looking at was trying to use some primary sources as opposed to doing some other research. And so I figured I'd come to people who lived through some of this stuff. And really, some of the questions are around your experience in the 60s and maybe groups that you were involved with that emerged during the 60s that would be considered countercultural, and really trying to gain a better understanding of the relationships and around that culture and the context and why it existed at that point, and then kind of dive into what's the historical significance and what was the character of the countercultural character, and then like what kind of revolutionary practices did the group engage in. So that's a lot, but the question is, what'd you do in the 60s that were kind of considered countercultural?
Yeah, well, there were lots of things because it was a whole world. So this one organization I was part of when I got out of college, the Vietnam War was going on, and there was an organization called the United States Servicemen's Fund, USSF, and it had been founded by some people who were had some of them had been GIs and some of them had not, but who were aware that there were plenty of GIs who were against the war, because some people had the assumption that people, who were fighting there wanted to be there. Lots of them were drafted. Many who weren't drafted, who did volunteer, nevertheless felt that it wasn't a great war, or they just started to change in some way. So USSF organized on army bases. And the way we did it was we set up coffee shops, as we call coffee houses, as we called them, where we'd have music one night a week, but we'd also do lots of counseling. So like I did a lot of counseling for GIs who wanted to get out on the basis often of conscientious objectors. So they'd maybe even at one point gone involuntarily, or else they'd been drafted, but they now felt that they were conscientious objectors. And it is possible to get out on that basis even when you're already in. So I learned the laws around that and other issues that could get people out. And so that was one of the services we offered, was legal counseling to get you out, or get you out of trouble if you were in trouble for demonstrating against the war. But we weren't actually really dying to get people out. What we wanted to help people do was organize from within, so that people would stop fighting in whatever way they felt safe doing it. So it was conceivably pretty dangerous stuff for the GIs. So I worked at the Westover Air Force Base, which was a B-52, it was a SAC, Strategic Air Command base, and B-52s, which were the bombers, flew out of there. So the people that I worked with were GIs. They weren't, the guy who flew the plane would have been an officer. He wouldn't have come. We had very, very few, if any, officers who were involved. And I worked there a couple of years, and we organized a lot of people so that there were GIs who were then doing the legal counseling, for example. We were no longer doing it. We ran a newspaper called the 99th Bummer. It was the 99th Bomb Wing of Strategic Air Command. So the newspaper was called the 99th Bummer. And it was against the war, but it wasn't all politics. So there'd be like lots of rock music and stuff of that sort that helped people, we hoped, connect to the counterculture, which was definitely make love, not war. So, it was, we saw ourselves as more political than hippie, but the GIs didn't, and so from our point of view, it was whatever worked for you. A cultural shift will mean you're not going to be that happy to be in the Air Force.
So clearly that's how you kind of worked locally as an organization. Do you feel like that group had a national or global impact?
I totally do. I think history really supports that idea. There were, I don't remember how many, maybe 12 local setups. There was a huge march at Fort Dix, which was outside of New York City, which is, it was a New Jersey Army base. That got a lot of publicity. It was become, you remember Winter Soldier. Winter Soldier was a big thing where people from the armed forces spoke to Congress about how they felt the war was going and what needed to happen. And I think that was partially a result of the big feeling that GIs did not support this war,
Right.
did not support this war. So I think it had a lot to do with ending the war. I absolutely do. I mean, there was one of the things was GIs would end up getting stoned a lot, which was not exactly actively ending the war or fighting against it, but morale was low.
Yeah.
And I think that was part of the whole thing. And then there were many GIs who were organizing within the armed forces to end the war.
Sure. Thinking about the work that you did then and what you see in society now, what do you think the historical significance is of what you did?
I don't know. It's not going well. For one thing, it seems like a real problem that there's no draft, because part of what was going on then was there were people from all walks of life who ended up in the armed forces, so they came with very different experiences, and that was very fertile for people to develop a view against the war.
Huh.
And that's not happening now. And the other thing that's happened is that there's this idea that's very pervasive that GIs were spat upon and treated really badly when they came back, called baby killers and stuff. And I don't think that happened at all. I don't think it happened at all. And I think that part of the reason it didn't happen was because the GI movement, which was had lots of college kids in it as well as all kinds of other people, including ex-GIs, made it very clear that most of the GIs were victims too.
Huh.
And so people didn't do that.
That's interesting.
But I think this movie by Rambo, one of these Rambo movies with Sylvester Stallone, put that in there, and now people believe it happened. So a lot of that was a powerful thing about the GI movement was that a lot of them were non-college bound kids, working class kids, and they got very involved in the anti-war movement. It wasn't just upper middle class kids, and I'm afraid that, which was really important, I think, is gone.
Right.
Because there's no draft, and plus they've got this other idea that college kids spat on
Right.
GIs.
Looking at kind of what's happening in the world today, and the feel that there's somewhat of a revolutionary feel right now. There's a lot of protest, there's a lot of angst, there's a lot of uprising, and it comes from different places. Do you think there are links back to the 60s in terms of the countercultural push away from the dominant, be it political or otherwise, the dominant ideology?
I don't know. It's really hard to say. I mean, the anti-war movement came out of the civil rights movement, and the civil rights movement has probably more through lines to this stuff, And
Sure.
the anti-war movement, the same people were involved in both, and civil rights was absolutely crucial to the anti-war movement as well. So there's that, but the real countercultural thing was so anti-money and anti-capitalism, and I don't see that much. I saw that in Occupy Wall Street.
Sure. So you think that the main their common thread of the different countercultural movements in the 60s was a shared pushback against capitalism?
In the sense that it was a real reevaluation of what makes you happy and whether money is important, and things like growing your own food and doing your own work and stuff like that. And it doesn't. I don't see that much of that.
Sure. We talk about a lot in the class that one cause likely isn't going to shift and cause a revolution. Counterculture can exist. Seeds are planted. and they germinate and they grow and they become something bigger. But that something bigger is often um, a result of a colliding of different countercultures that take on each other's energy and grow and become something, because not that they fought for the same cause, but because they exist at the same time with the same energy.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, the other thing that I think that maybe is kind of part of what you're saying is that the feeling of being part of a movement that is so important to you and feels like it's going to change what your future is. That never goes away, and even though things change, that feeling is so great. And I think a lot of young people and people of all ages who are involved in this stuff have that feeling. So that'll be something that many of them will keep in their minds and
Sure.
change, like whether or not they become bankers or something.
I know that Jack mentioned that, without a sense of history, it's hard to imagine that the work that was done in the 60s is really impacting the people who are here today. But I would counter with, and I hope that it's true, that that knowledge is kind of percolating, and it is resurging, and there are people who are historians, and there are people who have maybe taken this idea of uh, counterculturalism from parents and grandparents, and even if it's not a direct descendant, that there's a lineage there somewhere.
I think Occupy Wall Street has more of it than anything that I've seen since. I mean, the George Floyd stuff is super important and has links to civil rights, but I don't.
Right, maybe not the same.
Yeah.
Well, I think I'm going to try to marry these two things together and see what happens.
It's
But
gonna be
thank
fascinating.
you. Thank you very
It's been
much.
fun.
Both of these interviews were conducted by David Olofsson with Jack Levert and Cindy Ballinger on May 2nd, 2021, in Essex, Vermont.